and welcome to another edition of Ask the Historian. I'm your host for this video, Reverend Jake Zabel, the St. John's Evangelical Lutheran Church located in Dalby, Queensland, Australia, a member congregation of the Confessional Orthodox Evangelical Lutheran Communion. So today's question is about the origins of the United Evangelical Lutheran Church in Australia. In Australia. I believe it is in Australia. Yep, found it in the notes. Most people do confuse this and call it the United Evangelical Lutheran Church of Australia, but the official name was the United Evangelical Lutheran Church in Australia, sometimes shortened to the ULCA or the UELCA. And so this video is, can you explain the origins of the UELCA? Well, that's really easy. The UELCA formed in 1921 as an amalgamation of 4 different synods in Australia: the Evangelical Lutheran Emmanuel Synod, the Emmanuel Synod Old Basis, the Evangelical Lutheran Synod of Queensland, the Evangelical Lutheran Synod of Victoria, and the United German and Scandinavian Lutheran Synod of Queensland. So those 5 churches amalgamated in 1921 and formed the UELCA. There you go, that's the history done. Okay, so seriously, because this channel is to give Australian Lutheran history, let's give a much more in-depth explanation about this. So I'm going to try and talk about the origins of those 5 church bodies, but I'm going to go and do it as quickly as I can, giving the quickest overview as I can, so this video is still reasonably short. So, a good way to keep track of this history is to head over to the Order of Knight George website, www.knightgeorge.info, and check out the timelines I've done regarding all the different synods in Australia. So, to find that, you go to the Articles tab, go down to the tab that says Other, click on that, go down to the bottom of the page, and you'll find 3 different timelines there, one from 1838 to 1900, one from 1900 to 1966, and one from 1966 kind of up to 2018. I haven't done one since 2018, but not a whole lot has happened in the last 2 years, so it's not dramatically changing the timeline. But if you go and click those, that will help you to keep track of what I'm talking about. There'll be a lot of dates and stuff on those timelines. I myself am going to be looking at them while I'm doing these videos. And so basically, as I said, there's 4 main bodies that made up the United Evangelical Lutheran Church. But even they themselves technically were already made up of 2 coalitions or joint synods. I don't know what you'd call the term. There was the Church Federation, which was made up of the Emmanuel Synod. It's the Evangelical Lutheran Emmanuel Synod, just commonly called the Emmanuel Synod, and also the United German Scandinavian Lutheran Synod of Queensland, or as I like to call them for short, the UGS, the United German Scandinavians. And then there is the other joint synod known as the General Synod, which was made up as the Emmanuel Synod Old Basis. There was also the Evangelical Lutheran Synod of Victoria, which I just called the Victorian Synod, and the Evangelical Lutheran Synod of Queensland. Again, I just call it the Queensland Synod. So those are the 5 main bodies that made up the UELCA, and they themselves were originally part of 2 kind of joint bodies themselves. So to give a brief history going back, so the oldest one of those would be the Emmanuel Synod. It goes all the way back to Carvel, well, kind of. So what happened in 1846 was there was a split between Pastors Carvel and Pastor Fritzer over a number of issues. One was millennialism. Pastor Carvel started the Langmile Light Path Synod, or the Light Path Langmile Synod. The L's normally get mixed around depending on who you talk to and which history book you look at. So then in 1860, Pastor Carvel died, and this fight broke out between who was going to be his successor. So unlike Fritz's synod, which had basically instituted term limits on their presidents, Carvel basically made himself president for life, and when he died, this left this power vacuum inside his synod. And so there was a fight between Pastors Urch and Pastor Studenmeier. That's Johann Christian Urch and Wilhelm Studenmeier. And basically they couldn't agree who was going to be leader. And when the synod basically went with Pastor Urch, Pastor Studenmeier broke off, and he took a Pastor Kepler with him and some other supporters, and they went and formed the Tanunda Light Path Synod. So later in 1864, there was this thing called the Confessional Union. This was a kind of coalition of synods when Pastor Fritz's Evangelical Lutheran Synod of South Australia, as it was called at that stage, and Pastor Eric's at this stage Langmar Light Path Synod, they entered into a union. What happened later was in 1874, this union was dissolved when the Langmar Light Path Synod wanted to have fellowship with the Evangelical Lutheran Synod in Victoria, and the Evangelical Lutheran Synod of South Australia didn't want to have that fellowship, and so they broke fellowship. But then at this stage also, the Tanunda Light Path Synod, which was already in fellowship, they were already in fellowship with the Evangelical Lutheran Synod of Victoria, so the Tanunda Light Path Synod and the Langmar Light Path Synod, they merged in 1874 to form the Emmanuel Synod. And then in 1876, them in the Evangelical Lutheran Synod of Victoria officially formed the General Synod. Just before going back a few steps, the Evangelical Lutheran Synod of Victoria was founded in 1856 by Pastor Matthias Goeth. So they formed there in 1876. Come 1874, there was a fight going on, though, between the Emmanuel Synod and the Victorian Synod over the Victorian Synod practice of calling non-Lutheran pastors to serve their congregations. They were calling Presbyterians and Baptists and Anglicans and Methodists and all that to come serve in their congregations, and the Emmanuel Synod didn't want to have anything to do with that. They were a bit more confessional, they were more Old Lutheran, whereas the Victorian Synod was very much Union Lutheran. To understand those terms, go and watch my previous video where I explained the Old Lutherans and the Union Lutherans. So in 1884, the Emmanuel Synod left the General Synod. However, there was a bunch of congregations and pastors within the General Synod that wanted to remain in the General Synod, so they broke off and formed the Emmanuel Old Basis, because they wanted to keep the old ways of the Emmanuel Synod being part of the General Synod. Then you also have happening in 1885, you have two synods forming in Queensland. And again, this happened from the more confessional Old Lutherans fighting with the more liberal Union Lutherans. So the Union Lutherans, these are pastors from the Gosner and Basel trained seminaries, they formed the Evangelical Lutheran Synod of Queensland, whereas the more confessional pastors from the Hermannsburg seminary, they went and formed the United German and Scandinavian Lutheran Synod of Queensland. And so that begins those two church bodies in Queensland. The Queensland Synod would later in 1889 join the General Synod. Then in 1910, you would have the Emmanuel Synod and the United German and Scandinavian Lutheran Synod of Queensland join and form the Church Federation, as they were both kind of old Lutherans and much more confessional. The Church Federation had a desire for peace, though, with the General Synod. So in 1912, in February, at the St. Stephen's Lutheran Church in Adelaide, South Australia, the churches of the Church Federation and the churches of the General Synod met to discuss fellowship. A further meeting was held in May of 1913 in St. John's Lutheran Church, Matoa, Victoria. Negotiations would stop, though, due to World War I, and then in the years 1920, 1921, they would again raise discussions over fellowship. In June of 1920, the Victorian Synod and the Emmanuel Synod Old Basis decided to basically leave the General Synod and become official members of the Church Federation. The only church to not leave was the Evangelical Lutheran Synod of Queensland, which then technically was the last member of the General Synod. This was because the two Queensland synods were still kind of at each other's throats and couldn't sort out their disputes. But in March of 1921, the Victorian Synod, the Emmanuel Synod, and the Emmanuel Synod Old Basis decided that they were just going to merge together and form their own synod, the United Evangelical Lutheran Church in Australia. In May of 1921, the Queensland Synod and the UGS would finally merge together themselves and form the Queensland district of the UELCA. And so that's basically the origins of the UELCA. There's a lot more history before that and after that, but that's basically the simplest history I can give you. This video is already going to be much longer than I'm intending, so I'm going to leave it there. I've been your host, Jake Zabel. Goodbye, God bless, and if you'd want to have any of your questions answered on future videos, please email us at nightgeorge@outlook.com.au or message us on Facebook. Goodbye, God bless.